through my door, then jumped on my bed. Pulled the covers up over my head, said, "Oh, please do something with Fred." He jumped on my bed, put through the covers with his claws, tried to get me, but my alarm went off and then silence. It was a whole new day. I thought, I wasn't scared of him anyway, until I noticed those rips in my sheets, and that was proof that there had been a nightmare on my street.
for being here tonight. Happy Halloween! Yes! You all look amazing. Who's ready for some ghost stories? My name is Lisa Carlin, and this is Andrew Austin on piano. I know that song, and I know you do too. Let's give a warm public theater welcome to Greg Young and Tom Myers, the Bowery Boys.
Wow. Hi, everybody.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Young.
And I'm Tom Myers. They're a good audience, Greg. We are so glad to be here tonight.
It's just amazing to look out and actually see like real live human beings, an actual audience. Yeah. Isn't that great?
This is as close to a complete stranger as I've been in 20 months. Hi. You haven't gotten served yet. Okay.
And it's not just us. We're also being joined right now by those watching us on a live stream for the first time ever.
Say hi to the people at home.
Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you're all enjoying big bowls of Halloween candy right now.
Yeah, or dressed up in fabulous Halloween costumes.
Oh, sure.
Or their pajamas, or nothing at all. Your choice. You're at home.
But speaking of costumes, we see a few out there. We have is it a fox right there? We have a member of the animal kingdom here. We have
We have let's see, Mario brother over here, I believe. Nice to see you. And friend, princess. Oh, also Mario brother. Friend.
we were told there's a Wonder Woman. Is there a Wonder Woman here?
There she is.
We are really grateful to have you here. We might need some help later, saving the world. You know.
And it looks like we have a number of Robert Moseses in the house too.
Tom, I think those are just normal people in normal suits.
Oh, you look great. Yeah. For those of you who don't know us, who have just been dragged here by your well-intentioned friends, welcome. Greg and I have been hosting the Bowery Boys podcast since 2007. We have 375 episodes of our show that are available for you for free wherever you get your podcasts. And I am curious, we have to talk about this. I'm curious how many people in the theater right now are in a theater for the first time in a year and a half. I am too.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool. We just want to thank the entire staff and crew here at Joe's Pub and the public for, coming up with the reason that we're gathered here together again and bringing us back together. So. And, of course, we want to give a warm welcome to our musicians this evening. Once again, Andrew Austin on the piano. And the lovely Lisa Carlin on vocals. You're going to hear more from her later.
And, not to bring us all down, but the last time that Greg and I appeared on a stage before a live audience was on March 2nd, 2020. That night, with rather reckless innocence, we hosted the award show for the Gods Association of New York City at the SVA Theater on West 23rd Street. And 2 days later, we taped an episode of our show at a studio in Midtown on the shirtwaist strike of 1909. And then a week later, everything changed.
Yeah, we don't really need to remind anyone here of what a blur the next 12 months were. Those were challenging for everyone. And, as for our show, we recorded nearly 50 episodes remotely. We were not in the same room. In fact, we hardly even saw each other for more than a year. And, obviously all of our live shows were canceled because, all live shows were canceled.
But our business was sustained by our patrons during this really difficult period. Any patrons here? Wow. Thank you so much. It's not an exaggeration to say that it's because of you and your support that we were able to keep doing the show. We would not have continued with the show had we not had your support, so thank you.
Yeah. By the way, Charlie Chaplin, I see you. All right, who's ready for some ghost stories? Well, for those of you who have attended our previous performances at Joe's Pub, you're familiar with some of our friends who have gathered here on the stage here. Right here, of course, we've got Sheryl Crow.
She's still masking. She caught the bird flu last week.
Full disclosure, our past few live shows at Joe's Pub have been disrupted by some unexpected visitors. The ghosts of historical figures who have made their presences known on this stage.
Yeah, the first year Peter Stuyvesant paid us a little visit, and last time around it was actually the ghost of Washington Irving. Remember that, Greg? Boy, was that spooky. You'd think we were ghost magnets. But we've consulted with some mediums, and fortunately it seems that we have exhausted the entire supply of neighborhood ghosts.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
so
yes.
Really nobody left. In the
Not
words
one?
of the great Zelda Rubinstein from Poltergeist,
This house is clean.
so with Greg, I'm sorry. What is Cheryl standing on top of?
I don't know.
What is that?
Did someone leave us a note?
Oh, who left a note for us up here? How'd they get up on stage?
We do have email addresses, but I do like the old-fashioned kind of a... let's see. Groans in the air, groans in the seat. The groans from these jokes have rustled my sheets.
I should have skipped that bird flu joke. Beware ye boys of the Bowery, for Giddy arrives in just an hour.
An Bowery?
Bowery's hard to rhyme with. But
Who is Giddy?
I don't know, but we better giddy up before she gets here.
Well, Tom, I'd like to start things here in a fun little spot where the party never ends. A landmark where artists, musicians, and filmmakers have commingled to produce some of the most innovative works in American culture. The place I'm talking about is the Chelsea Hotel.
Oh, here for the Chelsea. It's one of the city's most creative spots, right? I mean, right up there with the Village. I mean, think of all the icons who have lived there, checked in there, slept there, tried to sleep there.
However, for every famous person who has lived at the Chelsea, there are 99 others whose stories have been forgotten. It's actually a place that's filled with misfortune and mystery and even murder. And that's why the name of this story is the Hotel of Horrors.
Lisa Carlin, ladies and gentlemen.
Woo! Damn. All right. Of course, the Chelsea wasn't always a hotel when it first opened in 1884. In fact, it was one of New York's first cooperative apartment buildings built by the architect Philip Hubert. It was a very innovative idea at the time. It was a utopian commune of sorts. And Hubert had designed several of these co-ops throughout the city, but the Chelsea was the most famous, with its distinctive iron balconies reflected upon inside the structure via a grand iron staircase.
It's very goth. Victorian Gothic, that is. Who lived in the Chelsea in the late 19th century?
Well, obviously this commune idea immediately appealed to bohemian types, many of them who worked in the nearby theater district. But unfortunately, the neighborhood itself became decidedly less fashionable by the 20th century, and the whole thing went bust by 1905. The Chelsea was then converted into just a proper actual hotel. But it never lost that bohemian charm. In fact, as a place that was a little rough around the edges with cheaper rooms, it actually became even more popular with actors and writers and musicians throughout the years.
Yeah, and popular for decades, with famous guests from Mark Twain to Andy Warhol. And even though the Chelsea had mostly become a hotel by this time, people could still live there. They were long-term lodgers, if you will.
And they do to this day. Maybe someone here does. I don't know. That would be cool. Speak up now. Anyway, and because people made a home here, the Chelsea began to take on characteristics of its inhabitants, imprinted with the eccentricities and oddities of its residents. Many historic hotels are actually this way, but none are so possessed of the unusual as the Chelsea.
So there are clearly a lot of spirited people who are staying at the Chelsea, but are there actual spirits? Is the Chelsea Hotel haunted?
Well, creative people often invite darkness into their lives. And on occasion, that darkness lingers on. Think of all the raucous and scandalous behavior that has occurred here. Is it impossible to imagine that other darker ceremonies have taken place here? A hint of the occult or the brazen summoning of evil things?
You won't find that at the Ramada. So is that why there are ghosts at the Chelsea?
Possibly. In fact, according to one long-term resident, one long-time tenant, clerks at the Chelsea's front desk are used to moving overnight guests to new rooms, sometimes in the dead of night, due to something unexplained that they've experienced.
Unexplained, as in supernatural?
Yes. Take room 124, for instance, 124. Guests here regularly report seeing the blurry shape of an old man standing quietly in the bathroom, and the sounds of a woman shrieking outside the door when nobody was in the hallway. Perhaps one of the most unexplained encounters involves the frequent sightings seen on the 5th floor, a woman named Mary, a ghost named Mary. She's somehow related to a very tragic event, the 1912 sinking of the Titanic. The survivors of this ocean disaster were brought to New York, and many in the aftermath stayed here at the Chelsea Hotel. It's believed that Mary was either a survivor or mourns a loved one who perished on the Titanic. Some even say that she hung herself here on the 5th floor. Guests have witnessed her gazing into a wall as if admiring herself in a mirror, beautifully dressed, fixing her hair, combing it, rather indignant at those who dare to look. And at other darker moments, Mary has been seen huddled on the floor, wailing and moaning.
Oh. So Mary is haunting the 5th floor. Are any of the other floors haunted?
Oh yeah. Famously, there are stories about the writer Dylan Thomas, who was staying on the 2nd floor in room 206 in the fall of 1953. He was a heavy drinker and was out on a very infamous binge at the White Horse Tavern in the West Village, then came back to his room where he later collapsed. After falling into a coma, Dylan Thomas died at St. Vincent's Hospital.
And at the height of his career, what a tragedy.
He was most famous, some of you may know, for the verse which begins with the line, "Do not go gentle into that good night." And it seems that Dylan Thomas did not go anywhere, gently or otherwise. In 2009, a tourist staying at the Chelsea was having trouble falling asleep, disturbed by strange noises outside of her room, and then footsteps which seemed to come from inside the room. Finally, a most terrifying sight. In her own words, quote, "I suddenly looked up and right in front of the bedroom mirror, I saw a head floating in midair. The face seemed to be wearing some kind of theater makeup, bright red lips drawn on very carefully, white face paint, and ear-length, tightly coiled black hair. I have an idea of who this man was after looking at images of the famous people that lived there and departed to the afterlife. It was the same face, that same grimace, and those same sad and large eyes. It was the face of Dylan Thomas. And then it vanished."
Okay. I'm ready to check out. I think we've heard enough.
Oh, but Tom, we still need to visit the most infamous room at the Chelsea Hotel, room 100. Sid Vicious, from the British punk band the Sex Pistols, stayed at the hotel in 1978 with his girlfriend Nancy Spungen. According to a later account written by Nancy's mother Deborah, Sid and Nancy were often troublesome guests. Understatement. In the fall of 1978, while staying on another floor, quote, "One of them nodded off in bed with a lit cigarette and set the mattress on fire. Reportedly, a hotel employee rushed up to their room with a fire extinguisher to find them wandering around, oblivious to the smoldering mattress. The manager then moved them to another room, room 100. On October 12th, 1978, the lifeless body of Nancy Spungen was found beneath the sink in the bathroom of room 100, brutally stabbed, most likely by Sid himself, although many other suspects have been suggested throughout the years. For his part, Sid was extremely distraught and wished that he had been the one to die. In the hospital, he actually pleaded, "I want to die. I want to join Nancy. I didn't keep my part of the bargain." 4 months later, Sid Vicious died of a drug overdose. But room 100 has never been the same. Guests have reported seeing a glowing miasma hanging about the bathroom. And the ghost of Sid Vicious has also been seen, getting into the elevator on the first floor, or sometimes simply hanging around the elevator in the lobby. At times, the elevator doors mysteriously open at random floors, although nobody has called for it and nobody steps out. Many still think that Sid Vicious is still here, looking for his girlfriend's killer, or possessed of a guilt so dark that it keeps him forever in a restless state, forever lurking the hallways of the Hotel Chelsea. I'm sorry. Before we move on to your story, Tom, I should probably add that a lot of drugs have been taken at the Chelsea Hotel, okay? So this might explain some of the stories here, and it also might explain the presence of the most famous ghost at the Chelsea.
There's another one?
Yes, Tom. A terrifying wraith known as Larry.
Larry?
Larry. He's often described as an annoying ghost, known for being a loud talker, droning on incessantly and keeping people up at night. Always sharing his unsolicited opinions and complaining from the beyond.
So Larry's a New Yorker. Okay, but hey, do you think that might explain our little note here? Do you think that maybe it was written by Larry? Oh, come on.
No, this note was clearly written by Giddy, not Larry.
Okay. Oh. All right. For my first story, I'm taking us out to Flatbush. We're going to the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn. We're headed to Bedford Avenue between Clarkson and Winthrop Streets. But in the mid-1700s, this was but the quaint little village of Flatbush.
So today, just east of the, picture this in your head, just east of the lower part of Prospect Park, which obviously was not there in the 1700s.
No, at this time it was mostly farms, dotted with large estates. And here on 20 acres of land was a sprawling mansion. It was set way back from the road, surrounded by green lawns and gardens. It was a rambling home with secret rooms and hidden staircases, and one very angry spirit. For the name of my story is The Secret Chamber of Melrose Hall.
Melrose Hall, was this a ghost story produced by Aaron Spelling?
No, that was Melrose Place.
Ah.
This is Melrose Hall. This story, we like that joke. This story begins with a well-connected Englishman named Lane, who in the mid-1700s was kicked out of England because of his rather wild ways.
Wow, he was kicked out of England, so he must have been really wild to be kicked out of the country.
Yeah, and he was forced to move to Brooklyn.
Where they do take everybody.
And where he continued his carousing. And in 1749, Mr. Lane, quite wealthy by this time, built this 3-story mansion in the village of Flatbush. Now, from the outside, it appeared rather old-fashioned, with 2 wings leading off of its central hall and a steeply pitched roof. However, in an 1895 article, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle wrote that, quote, inside it was a pretentious and costly mansion. The great double oaken door led into an immense hall, taking up the entire length and depth of the main house. The polished floor was covered with rich Persian rugs, bear, tiger, and lion skins, and the walls were hung with paintings by old masters, interspersed with instruments of war and the chase.
I can picture it now. It's like a dinner theater production of Clue.
That's not a diss, right? No.
No.
When Mr. Lane died in the 1760s, the mansion was purchased by the Colonel William Axtell, who was a British-born loyalist. Axtell was also a playboy, and he liked to throw wild parties and get wild, and he changed his mansion accordingly. According to the Eagle, Melrose Hall was soon known for its, quote, dark corridors, oddly shaped rooms, winding stairways, black holes, mysterious trapdoors, and other unprecedented features. And this included an apartment that was built over the ballroom, which was not connected with the rest of the house. And its only light that it received came through 2 small stained glass windows that were sealed shut.
So while he's throwing these parties there, let's keep in mind, like, tensions are boiling over with England at this time.
His homeland, and also his employer. Oh.
Opa!
And he also built dungeons, so that if he were attacked, he could lock up the rebels, right?
Really just thinking of everything, wasn't he, in this big old house? Did the public, did anyone know what was happening out here?
Well, his friends did. They partied here often in the 1770s. According to the Eagle, it was a scene of sumptuous dinners, splendid balls, costly private theatricals, and receptions that were attended by men famous in civil and military life, and women renowned for their beauty and accomplishments. But meanwhile, Axtell was also a man torn romantically. He was the 2nd son of a noble family in England, and years before moving to New York, he'd been engaged to marry a beautiful daughter of a wealthy British merchant named Millie. But unfortunately, right before the marriage, he'd found himself helplessly in love with her even lovelier sister, Alva. So he asked the girl's father for Alva's hand instead, but her father rejected this and threatened to cut her off from the family fortune if he should break his engagement with Millie. And so, back in England, he married Millie. And soon after, the couple settled into a boat and sailed for New York. And Axel purchased this mansion here in Flatbush.
And so, did he ever see Alva again?
Oh, yes. Because Alva sailed for New York on the very next ship in a disguise. Once in New York, she found a job as a maid while she set about hunting down her lover. One day she spotted Axel and Millie in their carriage, attended to by a driver and footman, and she managed to follow them back to this lavish, curious estate in Flatbush. Alva secretly made contact with Axel, who daringly snuck her into the house, escaping the notice of Millie and the servants.
And, fortunately, there's no shortage of creepy places in this house in which to, keep her.
Including that secret chamber above the ballroom. Now, aside from its two small windows, it contained a doorway that communicated down a small passageway with Axel's private study, where the opening was completely hidden by a bookcase. And Axel furnished Alva's secret cage lavishly with beautiful furnishings and artwork.
So Alva and Colonel Axel continued their secret affair up in this secret little room, while her sister was living in the same house. So how in the world did this work? How did they keep this a secret?
Well, there was only one maid who knew about Alva. She was an elderly woman named Rachel, and she was completely devoted to her and to the colonel. She brought her food, and she facilitated their meetings, often in the middle of the night, outside under the oak trees, by moonlight. Then Alva would be stealthily and silently ushered back into her hidden chamber. This continued for 3 years. 3 years of nightly moonlit visits, 3 years of hiding in this strange little room. One day, Colonel Axel was going to be called away for 6 weeks to help quell an uprising in a British territory, and he left Rachel to take care of Alva while he was gone, although the arrangement made him uneasy. What if something should happen to Rachel? He pleaded with Alva to reveal herself if she were in danger, to thump on the floor or bang on the walls, do something, cry out if for some reason she needed to make herself known. But Alva just shook her head and insisted that she would never reveal their secret, no matter what. Axel sailed off, and days later, Rachel died, leaving Alva alone and hungry. And she just had those two small windows sealed shut. Alva reclined and stayed silent. Weeks later, Colonel Axel returned from his trip abroad to find that there was a lavish dinner party being thrown in his honor. He felt extremely strange and uneasy, and he stepped back into the servants' quarters and asked to speak to Rachel, the elderly maid, only to hear that she had died. Panicked, he raced upstairs into his study, pushed aside the bookshelf, and ran to the secret chamber and found Alva dead. That night, under a full moon, he carried her silently outside, where he buried her under the old oak tree next to the mansion. And just 3 days later, he too died, leaving behind a full confession to his wife.
But was Alva truly gone?
Well, the next night, at midnight, a piercing scream rang out through the mansion, followed by low moans. The servants scrambled to locate it. It seemed to be coming from above the ballroom. And then the next night, again at midnight, a scream. And this time it was followed by low footsteps in the ballroom, and then in the kitchen, and then on the stairs. Alva was free. She finally had free run of the house.
But then whatever happened to Mrs. Axel, Millie, the sister?
Yeah.
Was she still living in the house? Could she continue living in the house?
According to the article about the haunting that was published later in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, as soon as Millie heard the noises and read her husband's confession, she and the family fled back to England. Wise move. And then Melrose Hall sat empty. For years, as residents of Flatbush whispered about ghosts, they passed by the haunted house quickly, afraid of hearing the cries that were said to come nightly from somewhere on the second floor. Decades after the Axtells left, a famous young actress named Anna Cora Mowat moved into the home and would write about it in her 1854 memoir, The Autobiography of an Actress. She wrote about the home, quote, "The house was a large, old-fashioned mansion, built before the Revolution. There were dark and spacious vaults beneath the kitchens, and there was a secret chamber above the great ballroom, to which no access could be found, save only by a small window. The neighbors affirmed that a young girl had been purposely starved to death in that chamber, and that her ghost wandered at night about the house. Indeed, this report had gained such credence that nothing could have induced many of the older inhabitants of the village to pass a single night beneath the haunted roof. The villagers stayed away because they knew the secret of the hidden chamber in Melrose Hall."
Goodness, that is tragic. Now that is actually really macabre. And so, but I'm trying to picture it on a map because it's right. It's near the site of like Prospect Park. Like, what's on the site of Melrose Hall today?
Well, in 1903, Melrose Hall was demolished, and today on the site of Colonel Axtell's mansion sits several residential apartment buildings and some local businesses. And over the ballroom itself, actually over Alma's secret chamber, sits a Crab du Jour Express. It's true.
Yeah.
Right there. We looked it up.
Well, unless you hate seafood, that is not very spooky. But here's a little number that'll spook everyone's socks off. A song about skeletons. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Carlin and Andrew Austin. Yes, it's called, if you couldn't guess, Spooky Scary Skeletons. It was by composer Andrew Gold, written in 1996. Andrew Gold, by the way, is also responsible for writing a song very close to, well, I bet a lot of people in here, the theme to the Golden Girls. Thank you for being
Wow, I knew we could get a Golden Girls reference into this Halloween show.
Always trying, always trying.
Does Rose look tall in that? Anyway.
Well, anyway, speaking of golden oldies, believe it or not, this past week, we released our 15th annual Halloween Ghost Story podcast entitled Gotham's Greatest Ghost Stories.
People have heard it.
All right,
Thank
good,
you for
thank
listening, patrons. Our very first Ghost Stories podcast was released in 2007. That was so long ago.
Yeah. Well, for my next tale, I'm actually going to reach back into that very first Ghost Story show and revisit one of the stories. A tale that takes place on a haunted Broadway stage. Now, it's not a famous actor or performer looking for their final curtain call. In this case, it's a theater producer who refuses to leave the stage. For the name of this story is David Belasco's Final Bow. Tom, we're headed to the Belasco Theater on West 44th Street. After many months of darkness, Broadway is back. And the Belasco stage is now alive again with the sounds of Bob Dylan in the new musical Girl from the North Country.
There must be some way out of here. Say the joker to the thief. There's too much confusion. I can't get no relief. Businessmen, they drink my wine. Plowmen dig my earth. None of them along the line know any of what is worth.
So, are you telling me that the stars of Girl from the North Country are packing audiences nightly into a haunted theater?
Even more, the Belasco Theater is haunted by its namesake, David Belasco, one of the most powerful theater impresarios of the 20th century. Belasco has a fascinating biography. He was born on July 25th, 1853 in San Francisco during the height of the gold rush. So young Belasco then drifted through the western states, serving as a stage manager for a traveling theater troupe, entertaining audiences in various one-horse towns. I can't imagine, it's crazy. He was both acting in the plays, but then writing them. He had time to do both, bringing the grit and the orneriness of the Old West into a formal theatrical setting. Now, in 1882, he moved to New York, and perhaps no surprise, took the theater district by storm. At around the same time that the Chelsea Hotel was being constructed, David Belasco was here writing and starring in plays in theaters in the Madison Square area. And by the time that the Broadway theater scene had moved up to Times Square, David Belasco had become one of America's most prolific playwrights.
And Belasco's shows were actually really naturalistic for their time.
Mm-hmm.
He was even considered edgy, which made him very popular for actors who were, looking for more challenging roles.
And because of that, Belasco could essentially just make or break careers. The world of the American stage can be vicious. Many of you know this. And it was even back then. The great battles of the Schuberts and the syndicates, for instance.
We have a show on that.
There are the oversized personalities, the egos of the day. And there was no personality and there was no ego quite as big as that of David Belasco. In 1907, the Belasco Theater was constructed on West 44th and exactly to his specifications, with a state-of-the-art hydraulic system, cavernous backstage, and Tiffany lamps everywhere. But perhaps the most unusual feature was a luxurious 10-room penthouse apartment perched on the top floor of the theater, literally above the stage itself.
He actually lived there too?
This apartment was the center of Belasco's life. He lived there, he worked there, he threw lavish parties there, he wooed producers and playwrights and chorus girls. Because you see, Belasco was also a bit of a Lothario. According to the New Yorker, quote, Belasco's apartment was the city's supreme bachelor pad, configured and employed for the seduction of leading and not so leading ladies. There was even a private elevator installed for just such purposes.
Okay, so he was a sleazy producer.
Mm-hmm.
But thankfully, things have changed.
Belasco really thought much of himself. He was frequently seen around town in a black waistcoat and a high clerical collar that earned him the nickname the Bishop of Broadway. Of course, few would actually describe his behavior as ministerial, but he was incredibly successful, and many notable plays debuted at the Belasco in the theater's early years, and even the occasional musical, including the 1927 smash Hit the Deck.
Sing hallelujah, hallelujah, and you shoo the blues away. And kiss the suya, hallelujah, gets you through the darkest day. Satan lies waiting and creating skies of gray. But hallelujah, hallelujah, helps you shoo the blues away.
On May 14th, 1931, yes, give it up. On May 14th, 1931, Belasco suffered a heart attack and then died later that day. From the New York Daily News, quote, "The great director called David Belasco from the stage of life yesterday. The dean of the theater died at about the time that the curtain was descending on a matinee production of his latest show, Tonight or Never, in the Broadway theater that bears his name. When she heard of the producer's death, the show's star, Helen Gahagan, fainted, but revived in time to carry on."
After all, the show must go on.
Oh, yes, indeed. And actually, at the Belasco Theater, it was about to enter its heyday, believe it or not, with many great plays making their Broadway debuts here. You've got Dead End, 1935, Golden Boy, 1937, Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, any fans? 1955, but perhaps the most famous of all, in 1959, A Raisin in the Sun. And present at all of these productions was a most critical observer, the ghost of David Belasco, truly larger than life. Encounters with his spirit were experienced throughout the 20th century by actors, musicians, and crew members alike. He was frequently seen dressed in his black waistcoat and his high clerical collar, often smoking a cigar with a scowl or a discontented look on his face. During rehearsals, actors would sometimes smell cigar smoke, as if he were standing over their shoulder, quietly critical of a line read. If an actor was giving a poor performance, she might return to her dressing room to find the entire place trashed, furniture overturned, as if Belasco had flown into a furious rage. Oh, but the ghost could also be complimentary. Actors who pleased him with their performances reported sometimes feeling a firm grip on their hand, their arm pulled by an invisible force, as if receiving a handshake. And when he was really pleased, the sound of applause could sometimes be heard from up in the balcony, even though there was nobody up there.
That must have been so unnerving to the actors.
Well, and this is this is true, remarkably. Their sightings were so frequent back then that some actors thought it was a good omen if he made an appearance. Ushers who experienced Belasco firsthand, however, were not as comfortable with these brushes with the supernatural. One usher, tidying up after a performance, witnessed the ghost of Belasco standing in the lobby. When the usher playfully shouted, "Good night, Mr. Belasco," all the lobby doors violently swung open. Belasco wasn't going anywhere. The usher, however, quit that very night. Late into the night, the elevator at Belasco's apartment was sometimes heard operating, despite the fact that the elevator, in fact, the entire apartment had been sealed shut since 1935. And yet, night watchmen reportedly heard the laughter and shouting of loud parties coming from the penthouse apartment, echoing through the dark auditorium.
It's like Belasco never left. So, how do you solve a problem like Belasco?
Well, by the 1960s, David Belasco's particular style of theater was now considered passé. So you can imagine how this supernatural being reacted when it first experienced the show, which debuted here on February 17th. It made its Broadway debut, on February 17th, 1971. Oh, Calcutta. An avant-garde musical revue famed for featuring actors who performed in the full nude. And if that wasn't shocking enough, it was followed here in 1975 by a London import about a pansexual cross-dressing mad scientist named Dr. Frankenfurter, played by Tim Curry in the musical The Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Like the rain, he was ill the day the earth stood still, but he told us where we stand. And Flash Gordon was there in silver underwear. Claude Rains was the invisible man. And then something went wrong for Fay Ray and King Kong. They got caught in a celluloid jam, and a deadly pace that came from outer space. And this is how the message ran. Science fiction, that's double feature. Let me hear ya. Dr. X will build a creature. See androids fighting Brad and Janet, and Francis stars in Forbidden Planet. Oh, 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 oh. At the late night double feature picture show. Yes.
Well, apparently, the combination of these two shows together were apparently too much for the ghost of David Belasco, for, believe it or not, no sightings of the spirit have been experienced here since the opening of Rocky Horror. It's as though he knew it was finally time to exit the Belasco stage right.
And thus ends the haunting of the Belasco Theater?
Not quite. For there is one more entity which haunts the theater, and she is still seen occasionally to this day. A lady in blue, shrouded in a blue mist. Some claim she's a former chorus girl who flits about the backstage as though racing to hit her cue. Actresses have reported a blue glow emanating from their dressing room lights, as though the women were in the room with them, reminiscing about their own days on the stage. And these let me add, these are recent sightings, okay? So I would suggest that the cast of the current show at the Belasco, Girl from the North Country, be on the lookout for this blue spirit whose intentions are less obvious than those of David Belasco.
And who knows? I mean, maybe Belasco has come back to his theater. Broadway was dark for so many months. Maybe he returned.
Well, I know one sure solution for getting rid of him, and it's just a jump to the left.
With your hands on your hips. Lisa Carlin and Andrew Austin, ladies and gentlemen. Wow. Well, speaking of a pelvic thrust, my next story takes us to Chelsea. We're going to 131. It's dated, you know, but it's still funny.
It's fine. It works. It works.
We're going to 131 West 14th Street. That's between 6th and 7th, north side of the street, middle of the block.
So a busy spot, maybe you can picture it. There's like, express buses zipping by. There's a Salvation Army headquarters across the street.
Totally. It's a building you've gone by a million times. Probably never even really noticed it. It used to have a Desco vacuum cleaner shop in it. Remember that place?
There's remember that fabulous neon sign that's there? I mean, sadly, the vacuum dealership is closed.
Well, their business sucked. Thank you and good night. In any case, the 5-story building that's there today was constructed in the 1920s. But before that, a 4-story row house made out of brick stood there, which during the late 1870s and 80s served as a boarding house that was operated by a plucky Irish-American widow named Mary Carr. Now, initially, Mrs. Carr did quite well, keeping her boarding house filled with 30 tenants and servants, domestic helpers. They rented rooms upstairs. They dined downstairs in the basement level dining area.
So this was a time of boarding houses, to put yourself back in this, think of all the people moving to New York for jobs in the 1870s and 1880s from all around the world. So we always talk about people moving into tenements and where they might have lived, but many people moved into boarding houses as well.
That's true, yeah. They specifically made sense for tenants who didn't need an entire apartment, who could afford to pay somebody, especially to do the cooking for them. And there was actually a wide selection, a wide range of boarding houses that were available for every kind of taste and situation. They had upscale, intellectual, religious boarding houses to more jovial places. There were even theatrical boarding houses. Mary's boarding house here was a respectable house, filled with tenants, who held positions at shops and offices around town. But by the summer of 1881, it was hard to say how many tenants she had, because so many would stay for only a night or two before packing their bags and taking off. On June 23rd, 1881, alone, in fact, 6 of her tenants left the house. So that over the course of 1 week, she'd lost 13 of them. And that same thing was happening with her domestic helpers. I mean, Mrs. Carr could hardly convince anybody to keep working for her.
And so why was this? What was going on?
Well, the midnight visits was what was happening to nearly everybody inside. For this is the story of the boarders from beyond. You see, the boarding house at 131 West 14th Street was haunted with two ghosts, a man and a woman. He was tall and hunched over with sideburns and a mustache and large black eyes that terrified anybody who looked into them. And she was a young maiden, about 20 years old and pretty, with blonde hair that she liked to brush in the long mirror downstairs in the parlor. Pretty, although her face was also described as disfigured by marks, which would seem to indicate a life of dissipation.
How did these two unusual strangers go about haunting Mrs. Carr's boarding house?
Well, initially they just appeared to the staff. A maid walked into the front parlor one summer day in 1881 and noticed a young woman standing in front of a mirror, brushing her hair and pinning it back with a far-off look in her eye. She was seen several times by numerous staffers, always cleaning up for the day in the parlor. And then in a blink of an eye, she'd vanish. And he, the male ghost, at first stayed in the basement dining area. One afternoon, a waiter was setting the tables for a meal when he suddenly noticed a man hunched over, staring with dark eyes out the window and up at the sidewalk. The waiter was startled. He'd never seen this man before. And as the waiter approached him, the man just melted away into thin air. As more of Mrs. Carr's staff encountered these two ghosts, she found herself trying to reassure them, hold on to them, and pleaded with them to keep these appearances quiet. She'd be fine as long as the tenants didn't run into them. But it was hard to hide these encounters, especially once people started hearing sounds. The chambermaids and cooks started hearing thumps in the night. First, it was a loud thud that sounded like a body hitting the side of a door, followed by unearthly low groans.
And what about Mrs. Carr herself? Like, did she have any experiences with these?
Not at first, and she really sort of dismissed some of these claims as the product of an overactive imagination. But then one day, she started feeling sudden cold rushes. A burst of cold air would come over her as she was walking around the house.
Well, I mean, these kinds of houses, they could be drafty.
Yeah, maybe. But one June afternoon, as she was walking up the stairs, she suddenly felt an ice-cold hand on her face.
Well, that certainly was no draft.
And around this time, the ghost began to appear to the boarders as well. One night in the middle of June, at 1 o'clock in the morning, one of Mrs. Carr's oldest tenants, a man who'd been with her since she took over the house, awoke in a cold sweat. He just sensed that there was somebody else in the room with him. He glanced next to his bed, and he noticed a man standing right there, next to his bed, looking down at him with large black eyes and a menacing grimace. The poor boarder thought he must have been dreaming, and he tried to snap out of it, when suddenly the visitor grabbed his bed covers and yanked them to the floor before vanishing. The next morning, the man quietly told Mrs. Carr about this, but it sounded so ridiculous, and he convinced himself that he'd just dreamed the whole thing. Unfortunately, it happened again that night, and the next night. Finally, on the third night, he checked out.
Well, did she find someone else to rent his room?
Oh, Mrs. Carr had somebody by the next week. That man moved in and had the same visitor on his first night. Those cold black eyes. That tenant moved out the next morning. And so finally, Mrs. Carr went to the police.
Could these visitors have been like some kind of elaborate hoax?
Well, that's what Mrs. Carr was hoping for. But an officer from the 29th Precinct investigated and inspected the locks and determined that nobody could get in without a key. These visits were happening from the inside. On June 21st, he appeared again, this time in the chambermaid's room on the top floor. The chambermaid hadn't yet heard the story. It had been kept from her. Reading from a newspaper report a few days later, quote, Just before midnight, she awoke, experiencing a peculiar cold feeling. As she awoke, she saw a man standing a few feet from her bed, with his back toward her. Her heart stood still. The man turned and faced her. He was tall and slightly stooping, with side whiskers and mustache and large black eyes. His hand was raised and rested on his breast. The girl gave a scream and fainted. When she recovered, the figure was still in the room, but it had moved to a corner and stood there eyeing her. She fainted again and again recovered. The ghost was now at the foot of her bed, but he seemed to have diminished in height to only 1/2 the size. He gradually grew smaller and smaller until he disappeared altogether. The girl jumped from the bed and ran screaming down the stairs to Mrs. Carr, to whom she told her story. The whole house was aroused, and people in the streets, attracted by the girl's cries, congregated around the front door.
Well, so much for keeping these ghosts a secret. Now, apparently, the whole neighborhood knew about it.
Yeah. One policeman, Officer Chapman, asked a medium named Harry Payne to spend the night in the house and perform a seance. It was held that Wednesday night in the basement dining room with Mrs. Carr and several members of the staff. By 2 o'clock in the morning, no ghost had appeared, so Harry Payne, the medium, headed upstairs to a bedroom on the 4th floor to take a quick nap. He entered a bedroom, closed the door, lay down on a bed. In his hands, he held a whipstock, a whip, with which to defend himself should he need to. According to a news report later that week, he had fallen into a light sleep when suddenly he felt 2 large hands pounce on his 2 ankles, and with one wrench, he was thrown to the floor. Payne made an effort to rise and bring his whipstock into play, and he was not quick enough. As he raised his arm to strike, he saw what appeared to be a solid shadow pass rapidly through the open doorway and disappear.
Well, he keeps saying news reports.
Yes.
So all of this was published in a newspaper.
Yes. 2 days later, it made page 8 of the New York Times. Under the headline, 2 spectral lodgers, ghost in the 14th Street boarding house. And all the details are there, folks. I'll send you a link. The first boarder to leave, the chambermaid's visit, the description of both the male and the female ghosts. But there is one more detail, provided by another investigating officer, an Officer Clinge. He remembered the previous tenants of 131, a family who lived there before Mrs. Carr operated the boarding house. A family whose lives took a tragic turn. One of the daughters, a beautiful 24-year-old, was engaged to a seafaring merchant who, on a trip to Italy, had drowned. Already addicted to liquor, the poor woman drank herself into a stupor and died. Her brother, inconsolable in losing her, soon after poisoned himself. He too died. Officer Clinch reported in the Times, with some hesitation, that in fact the physical descriptions of the ghosts matched those of the tragic siblings he'd known at 131 West 14th Street. Siblings who apparently never left home.
Well, we've made it to the final story.
And not a moment too soon, folks, remember? Still no peep from Giddy.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah.
Remember
This
that clever
thing.
plot device? She said she'd be arriving in about an hour, but whew!
No, it looks like we escaped a visit from another ghost this year, so
All
that's
right.
great. Well, for our last story, our destination is actually just 1 block south of where we're all sitting right now. We're not getting up, we're staying here, but like, in your mind, we're going a block to a red brick row house with a curious past. The name of this story is Who's Living at the Merchant's House?
this is a crowd. The merchant's house gets an applause. That's great. Oh, the merchant's house. I love the merchant's house. Today, that's a wonderful museum that's literally around the corner from us on 4th Street between Lafayette and Bowery.
It's a charming and historic home, perfectly preserved in its mid-19th century splendor. It's as though the owners, the Treadwells, had simply walked out the door and left all their possessions behind.
In 1832, this area of East 4th Street was very fashionable. In that year, a successful milliner named Joseph Brewster built his house here in the Federal style, incorporating a few charming Greek revival touches.
Like other fine homes of the period, it featured a stately parlor and a sumptuous dining room separated by large sliding wooden pocket doors. Oil lamps and candelabras illuminated the hallways, the floors creaking as you walked upon them. Up the steep staircase, there were several large bedrooms offering views onto busy 4th Street or its lush formal gardens out back.
Just 3 years after it was built, in 1835, the house was purchased by a wealthy hardware merchant named Seabury Treadwell. He moved into the house with his wife Eliza and their 7 young children. And 5 years later, in 1840, Eliza would give birth to another child here, named Gertrude.
The family remained
I'm
together
sorry,
for...
Greg. Sorry.
What?
Did you write this? Somebody added to my script, named Gertrude, whom everybody called Giddy. Did you write that?
Giddy. Like Giddy Treadwell from around the corner.
I didn't write it.
It's like a pen, it's like a, yeah, your
It looks like it
handwriting's
was
not that
written
nice.
with a fountain pen. Okay.
I don't know.
All right.
Moving on. As I was saying, the family remained together in the house for many decades. In fact, the 4 younger Treadwell sisters never married and continued to live here with their parents, even as the neighborhood started to change, becoming less fashionable.
Not that Gertrude, Giddy, didn't try to leave. She'd fallen in love with a medical student named Lewis Walton. Unfortunately, he was Catholic, and the Treadwells were Episcopalians, and Gertrude's father forbade the union. Gertrude was heartbroken. In 1865, her father, Seabury, died in the front bedroom on the 2nd floor. He was 84 years old and surrounded by his children. In the 1880s, her mother passed away, and then one by one, so too did her sisters.
At home, and she was always at home, Gertrude dressed in her Sunday best, in her lace shawls and veils. In the 1880s, her mother passed away. As we just said that, sorry.
I jumped on it.
In 1930, right?
And meanwhile,
She screwed with my notes too. I didn't do anything. And meanwhile, the world changed outside her door as millions of newly arriving immigrants made New York their home, as the city built skyscrapers and subways, as automobiles replaced horse carriages on her street. She watched all of these changes from her window, and yet inside, time stood still in here as though it were still the 1830s.
in 1930, Gertrude turned 90. She spent these last years here, her only companion a maid, dressed from another era, in a black dress and white apron. As for Gertrude, she liked to wear her favorite dresses from the 1880s and 90s, nearly a half century before. In 1933, Gertrude Treadwell died in a bedroom on the 2nd floor of her home. There were few relatives or friends left to mourn. She was 92 years old.
And it seemed that even in death, she was going to make sure that the house was exactly as she wanted it. Soon after Gertrude's death, relatives and friends of the Treadwell family began to turn the home into a museum. This required researchers and specialists to spend hours examining the original furniture, clothing, and the textiles that filled the rooms.
One researcher in 1934, the year after Gertrude's death, was in the back bedroom on the second floor examining old clothes and felt somebody standing directly behind her in the bedroom. She put down the clothing, turned her head, and saw an elderly woman standing there beside her wearing a 19th century dress and glaring at her, as if she were wondering why this woman were rifling through her clothes. As the researchers stumbled for words, this woman disappeared before her eyes.
Gertrude didn't seem happy about all these intruders. She didn't want anyone in her rooms or even outside her door. Later that year, a group of children were playing loudly on the sidewalk outside the unoccupied house, when suddenly the front door swung open and a tiny elderly woman in a brown dress from another era stepped out to shoo them away, shaking her arms wildly. It did scare them off the lot, but she was also noticed by other neighbors who recognized this woman as their former neighbor Gertrude.
The museum would open 2 years later, in 1936, but Gertrude wasn't finished. In those early years of welcoming in the public, several visitors reported seeing an elegantly dressed lady, usually drifting around the top of the staircase and in the back bedroom. And the appearances have continued to this day. According to a docent at the house, Anthony Belov, who wrote a 2007 book specifically about the ghostly visits at the museum, Gertrude has shut the door in the face of would-be visitors, ringing the doorbell for admission. But she's not always rude. As she did in life, she continues to spend time in the front parlor, around her piano. On May 15th, 2005, multiple visitors asked the museum director about the lovely piano music that they'd heard coming from the front parlor. There's just one problem. The piano strings had been removed for restoration. The piano was unplayable.
On October 2nd, 2005, an evening concert was given in the same parlor featuring vocal works from the 1860s. Belov writes, quote, "At the reception following the performance, 4 separate audience members, none of whom had ever visited the museum before or had heard anything about the ghosts here, each mentioned that they thought they saw a petite elderly woman sit in the armchair in the corner, listening quietly to the performance. But by then, the singers might have been used to being visited by Gertrude, because the previous December in 2004, the same group was performing downstairs in the home's historic kitchen. The audience had moved inside the large room and had even started singing along with the performers. As the final carol ended, a voice cried out from the middle of the room, "Happy Christmas! Thank you all for coming to my house."
Now, hold on. The room fell silent as everybody turned to stare at the speaker, a woman who was just standing there as stunned as those people around her. Her face burned red as she raced out of the room, totally embarrassed. She later explained, quote, "I don't know what came over me. Suddenly I felt as if everybody had come to visit me, and I was so happy, and then I found myself shouting, 'Thank you.'" It was so odd, right? To everybody there except for a perceptive woman who had been standing just next to her. After hearing this shouting woman's experience, the perceptive neighbor admitted to those gathered that just before the woman cried out, she had noticed a sort of haze from around this woman's head, and she swore that she also saw the figure of a tiny elderly woman standing just behind her, touching her.
So are you saying that Gertrude Giddy visited the audience that night by possessing one of the participants?
Yes. And according to this witness, then Gertrude touched her, and then the next thing anybody knew.
She was there in the room with them. Ah! It is I, Gitty. Miss T, if you're nasty. I told you I'd be dropping in, and here I am.
Oh my God. We're so sorry. We did not mean to disturb you.
Do not hurt us. Please do not hurt us. What do you want from us?
We're just podcasters.
Unholy allegiance, our mortal souls, my ascot. What do you want?
It's not you that I want. We're all out of good bourbon at the merchant's house. Bartender, can you make me an old-fashioned?
Well, technically speaking, she's already an old-fashioned.
Silence! I still have something for you. A curse be upon ye for rustling my sheets.
A curse?
Here goes.
What is it? Speak now.
Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not.
And thank you to Kieran Gannon, who's helping us out on the visuals tonight.
Thank you to the entire team here at Joe's Pub.
We want to thank all of you. Thank you for listening to us and supporting us and coming out to the show tonight. And finally, we want to dedicate this show to the legacy of Joe Papp, who passed away 30 years ago today. And we wouldn't be here without his legacy. So, Joe, we hope you like the show, and thank you. Thank you. Happy birthday, Claire Connors.
Brought my